I came home to a federal crime. My century-old iron fence gone. In its place, twisted metal and Karen, HLE queen, sipping iced tea. You're welcome, she smirked. But her smugness would crumble. That fence wasn't just mine. It was a protected piece of history. Bulldozing it? A felony. What Karen didn't know. She'd just ignited a war with the past, and the entire neighborhood was about to fight back. She bulldozed my fence. That was the first thing I saw when I turned onto my street. My jaw dropped, foot still on the brake, because where there had once been a majestic black iron fence, hand-forged over 100 years ago, there was nothing but twisted steel, cracked cement, and one very smug woman standing beside a construction crew, sipping iced tea like she just won a gardening contest. Finally, she said, smiling at me as I got out of the car. That ugly eyesore was gone. You're welcome. I blinked. She didn't look panicked. She didn't look confused. No, she looked proud. Karen, the self-declared queen of our HOA, had apparently declared war while I was gone for the weekend. What she didn't know, and what would come crashing down on her like a freight train in the days to come, was that she hadn't just destroyed a fence. She destroyed a protected piece of American history. And that was a federal crime. 3 days earlier, that fence was my sanctuary, a relic my great-uncle spent years preserving. Tourists photographed it. Neighbors loved it. But Karen? She saw a threat to her beige utopia. According to her, it violated the HLA's visual harmony clause, a term she invented herself to bully residents into conforming to her bland, cookie-cutter version of suburban paradise. She hated individuality, hated character, and most of all, hated being ignored. I had ignored her, not rudely, just casually. She came over once with a list of suggested fence colors that better suited the community vibe, all of them beige. I thanked her, shut the door, and never brought it up again. That was mistake number 1. Mistake number 2 was underestimating just how far Karen would go to assert her control. It started small, a letter from the HLA citing me for excessive fence height. I replied with a scanned copy of the National Historic Registry certificate. No response. Then came the fines, $50 daily fines. Faceless citations. Karen's rulebook was fiction, but her threats were real. My lawyer laughed. They can't enforce that, he said. Your property predates the HLA by decades. Just ignore it. But Karen didn't ignore me. Her tactics escalated. Anonymous complaints showed up weekly. My bushes were too vibrant, my doormat too whimsical. She even accused me of lowering property values because a tourist once took a photo on my sidewalk. I thought she was just being her usual overbearing self. I didn't know she was planning something much worse. The night before destruction, I packed a small bag and left town for a weekend conference. I locked the gates, left the porch lights on, and didn't give the house another thought. In my absence, Karen saw opportunity. She called an emergency HLA meeting, one I wasn't notified of, and motioned for immediate remediation of non-compliant fencing. Nobody objected. Half the board were her friends. The other half were tired of arguing. By sunrise, her bulldozers would roll in, and my life would become a legal battleground. When I returned that sunny Sunday afternoon, I pulled into my driveway and stepped into what looked like a war zone. The air smelled like sawdust and hot metal. The fence was gone, its remains dumped in a heap beside the curb like scrap. Karen, standing in designer sandals with a clipboard and a wide-brimmed hat, greeted me with the enthusiasm of someone who just won HLA President of the Year. You'll thank me for this, she said. It was bringing down the whole block. I couldn't speak, not immediately. I walked over to the mangled remains of my fence. One of the rosettes, I knelt in the debris, clutching a rosette my uncle taught me to polish. Karen's laugh echoed. It's just metal. But metal outlives us all, and this piece would outlast her. I turned slowly. Do you know what you've done? I asked. She scoffed. Improved the neighborhood. That thing was ancient. My heart was pounding, not just from anger, but from the sheer audacity of what she'd done. This wasn't just vandalism. It was destruction of federal property. The demolition crew left a receipt. One signature would unravel everything Karen built. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. Karen told me to stop. "You're being dramatic," she said. "If you had a problem, you should have come to the meeting." I stared at her. "The meeting you never told me about?" She didn't answer. The crew started packing up. I got one of their names and took a photo of the work order Karen had signed. Then I called my lawyer. He answered on the second ring. By the time I was done explaining, he'd stopped laughing. "That fence was on the National Register?" he asked. "She bulldozed it?" I confirmed. There was a long pause. "This is very serious. She could be facing felony charges. Destruction of registered historical property carries a minimum fine of $10,000, and that's just federal." I turned and looked at Karen, who was now arguing with one of the neighbors about grass height. She was completely unaware of what she'd uttered. I filed a police report that night. The responding officer took one look at the documentation and whistled. "You said it was protected?" I nodded. "There's a plaque on the gatepost." "She bulldozed that too." He shook his head. "We'll need to loop in the feds." And just like that, the wheels began turning. Next morning, Karen woke up to find a federal investigator on her porch, and for once in her life, she had nothing to say. The fence wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a landmark, a relic, a piece of history that had survived generations, wars, storms, and time itself. Until Karen decided it crossed with her vision board. But what she didn't understand, refused to see, was that some things aren't just part of a neighborhood, they're part of a legacy. And when you bulldoze legacy bulldozes back. Karen wasn't the kind of person to back down. Even after the police visit, after the demolition crew realized they'd probably bulldozed something they shouldn't have, she still walked around the neighborhood like nothing had happened. She carried her clipboard with renewed determination, like this was just a bump in the road. What she didn't realize was that the bump she'd created was about to become a landslide. And I was no longer just a quiet neighbor with a historical home. I had become her worst nightmare, someone who knew exactly what buttons to press and had finally decided to press them all. The week following the fence demolition was a circus of passive-aggressive warfare. Karen doubled down on her authority. I received 3 more violation letters. One accused me of displaying unauthorized seasonal decorations. Another claimed my mailbox was not in accordance with community aesthetic, even though it was the same mailbox that had been there for 50 years. The third one fined me $200 for encouraging non-residents to loiter, referencing a group of tourists who had stopped to take pictures of the rubble. Would the neighborhood stay silent? Or had she finally pushed too far? I didn't give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I kept a straight face, collected every letter she sent, and forwarded them all to my lawyer. He was assembling a file thicker than a phone book. Meanwhile, I started gathering statements from neighbors. Turns out I wasn't the only one she'd been harassing. There was Mr. Delaney, 2 houses down, who'd been fined for growing tomatoes in his backyard. Mrs. Schmidt across the street had her garden gnome confiscated under the pretense that it was an unapproved yard ornament. Then there was Maria, a young mother who got cited because her toddler drew on the sidewalk with chalk. Karen had taken a photo of it and sent a formal complaint. These weren't rules. This was tyranny. The more stories I heard, the more it became clear. Karen's reign over the HOA wasn't just annoying. It was systematically oppressive. But the fence incident had shaken something loose. For the first time, people weren't afraid to speak. I started receiving anonymous notes in my mailbox. "We're with you." Karen's reign? It was crumbling, one secret at a time. I didn't just want justice for my fence. I wanted her gone. But before I could take the fight public, I had to prepare. That meant proving she had no legal grounds for what she'd done. The historical registry papers were solid, but I needed to make the case airtight. I returned to City Hall and requested records for my home, the HOA charter, and zoning laws. That's when I found something interesting. My house, along with 5 others on the block, had been built before the HOA was even established. According to the documents, any historical landmark predating the HOA charter was exempt from HOA structural regulations. Not only was my fence legal, it was untouchable. Armed with that information, I sent Karen an official cease and desist letter through my lawyer. Her response? Another violation notice, this time accusing me of weaponizing legal jargon to disrupt community harmony. That one made me laugh. I was starting to think Karen lived in a separate reality where her rules overrode federal law. I also began to suspect she didn't understand the seriousness of what she'd done. Most people would panic after federal agents knocked on their door. Karen just added more tulips to her garden and hosted a tea party for the HOA board. It was at that tea party where things took a turn. A neighbor I trusted, let's call him Jake, managed to get invited. He said the event felt less like a social gathering and more like a war council. Karen, red-faced and furious, ranted about entitled residents with outdated houses and how they were ruining her vision. She even floated the idea of creating a historical exception clause that would override existing laws. Of course, such a thing didn't exist, but Karen had never let legality stand in the way of her fantasies. That same night, a notice appeared on the community bulletin board announcing a special HOA vote. Topic: neighborhood beautification and standardization, which in Karen language meant more restrictions, tighter control, and likely a retroactive justification for bulldozing my fence. She was trying to rewrite the past, dress it up in bureaucracy, and make her crimes look like progress. I knew I couldn't stop the vote alone, so I did what any reasonable person would do. I turned the neighborhood into a political battleground. I printed flyers detailing Karen's history of abuses, from the garden genome crackdown to the chalk fiasco. I attached photos of the destroyed fence, side by side with documents from the historical registry. I dropped them in every mailbox. I even created a slideshow presentation and offered to speak at community gatherings. Some people were skeptical at first. Karen had always painted herself as the community's protector, but facts have a way of cutting through lies. Once people saw the receipts, the tide began to turn. 2 days before the vote, Karen struck again. A construction crew showed up at my house with a work order to remove unauthorized lawn fixtures. I asked to see the order. It was unsigned. When I called the company, they said the request had come from the HOA president. I stood in front of my porch, phone recording, and told them if they touched anything, I'd have them arrested. They left. I posted the video online, and it went viral. By now, even the local news had picked up the story. Suburban HOA war erupts over historic fence demolition, read the headline. Karen hated the attention. She'd built her empire in the shadows, using confusion and fear. The spotlight made her stumble. But she wasn't done yet. On the day of the vote, Karen arrived wearing a pearl necklace and her trademark smug smile. She carried stacks of new proposals, printed and bound like she was unveiling a master plan. But this time, people didn't clap. They didn't even smile. The room was quiet, tense. And when the vote began, I realized something magical had happened. People had stopped being afraid. They were angry. They were awake. I watched as neighbor after neighbor walked up and marked their ballots. Karen's hands trembled. She tried to joke, charm, explain. No one listened. The results came in. Her proposal was rejected by a landslide. That night, she posted a message on the HOA website claiming the vote was invalid due to manipulation by external forces. No one responded. Her power was slipping, and she knew it. She thought she could rewrite the rules, bulldoze the past, and silence anyone who resisted. But history has a long memory, and Karen had just made herself a permanent part of mine. Karen must have thought her stubborn smile could outlast the truth. But the truth doesn't blink. It marches forward with documents, dates, signatures, and consequences. And now that machine was rolling toward her faster than she could dodge. After the failed vote and the viral attention, I thought she might finally retreat, maybe even apologize. But no, Karen wasn't wired that way. Instead, she called a press conference on the neighborhood lawn. I'm not joking. She actually set up a folding table, put up a banner that said Community Preservation Committee, and handed out cupcakes while declaring herself the true victim in what she called a fence hysteria campaign. She claimed I had faked the historical documents and that the whole thing was a smear job to unseat her as HOA president. The woman had officially lost her grip. Unfortunately for Karen, The federal government doesn't care about cupcakes. The agents returned the following week. This time, they weren't just asking questions, they were collecting evidence. They requested access to HOA records, demanded copies of meeting notes, financial statements, and communication logs. Karen, still in her pearl necklace and delusion, tried to stall. She said the HOA office was being deep cleaned and that some records had been accidentally shredded. That was when things went from embarrassing to criminal. The feds weren't just looking into the fence anymore. They were starting to look into everything. And there was a lot to look into. With the help of my lawyer, we submitted a formal request for a forensic audit of the HOA's finances. It turns out the HO had collected over $70,000 in fines in just the past 3 years. A huge chunk of that money was supposedly spent on community improvement. But when the ledger came back, it told a different story. One entry labeled Neighborhood Wellbeing Enhancement was actually the purchase of an outdoor hot tub. Another labeled Emergency Aesthetic Fund turned out to be a $55,000 landscaping bill for Karen's personal yard. There were receipts, bank transfers, and credit card charges all pointing back to one person. It didn't take long before the community started whispering louder. People were furious. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. Karen had misused their money, bullied them with phony citations, and destroyed part of the town's heritage. Residents started showing up at HOA meetings they used to ignore, demanding answers. Karen tried to talk over them, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but her voice didn't carry the same authority anymore. Every sentence sounded like an excuse, and every smile felt like a lie. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to deepen. The Department of the Interior sent a representative to survey the damage to the fence. He walked the perimeter with a clipboard, shook his head repeatedly, and took dozens of photos. He told me that the fence had been listed on a regional landmark tour for over 2 decades. Its destruction wasn't just vandalism. It was classified under federal statutes protecting historic structures. That meant felony charges, and not just for the person who gave the demolition order, but potentially for everyone who executed it without proper permits. The demolition company quickly flipped. Their manager submitted a signed affidavit stating they were misled by the HOA president and had been shown falsified documents implying they had legal clearance to proceed. They even provided a copy of the order signed by Karen with a post-it note saying, "Urgent, owner verbally approved." That note was the smoking gun. My lawyer nearly dropped his coffee when he saw it. It proved intent. Karen knew she had no legal standing, and it proved that everything she'd done had been carefully, arrogantly orchestrated. By now, Karen's friends on the HOA board were jumping ship. One resigned and issued a public apology. Another claimed they had no idea what was going on and tried to shift blame. Only one remained loyal, a woman named Patty, famous for giving up parking citations like Halloween candy. Even Patty started looking nervous when the news van showed up. The local media had turned the story into a 3-part expose. Reporters interviewed neighbors, former board members, even the Historical Society president. Every segment ended the same way, with a dramatic shot of the destroyed fence and the headline, "Who gave the order?" Karen still hadn't answered that question directly. Her statements were vague, always dancing around the point. She blamed collective decisions and shared community vision. But no one bought it. The truth was visible in her eyes. Every day, she seemed more frantic, more tired. She stopped walking her dog. She stopped posting HA updates. Her smile, once so smug and unshakable, became forced and twitchy. Then came the moment that changed everything. A letter arrived from the Department of Justice. It stated that Karen was officially under investigation for destruction of federally protected property, misappropriation of funds, and obstruction of an ongoing federal inquiry. The letter was hand-delivered. She tried to slam the door in the agent's face. It didn't work. That night, she was taken in for questioning. Not arrested, not yet, but the sight of her being escorted into a federal vehicle was enough to make the neighborhood erupt with whispers, camera phones, and poorly hidden grins. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, as the agents pulled away. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Not because the damage had been undone, it hadn't. The fence was still gone, and the memories tied to it were still twisted in a scrap pile by the curb. But because, for once, someone like Karen wasn't getting away with it. The following days were surreal. Without Karen at the helm, the HOA fell into chaos. Meetings were postponed. Notices stopped arriving. Some people feared the community would fall apart, but instead, something better happened. Neighbors started talking to each other again, real conversations without fear of fines or threats. People shared lemonade on porches, offered to help fix up yards, even brought cookies to my door to say thanks. The absence of Karen felt like a weight lifted off the entire block. But it wasn't over. There was still a trial coming. There were still depositions, hearings, and questions. Every step of the way, the truth became louder than lies. Karen had tried to erase history. She tried to silence opposition with rules and regulations made from thin air. And now those same rules were collapsing around her. She didn't just lose control of the HOA, she lost control of her story. Once the truth took hold, not even she could bulldoze it away. The absence of Karen was like a breath of fresh air no one realized they needed until she was finally exiled. For the first time in years, the neighborhood wasn't living under constant threat of citations or surveillance. Lawns grew a little taller. Mailboxes got a little bolder in color. Kids returned to the sidewalks with chalk in hand, sketching dinosaurs and suns without fear of HOA retaliation. People who had once barely nodded at each other now shared jokes, offered tools, and even swapped gardening tips. Karen had built a kingdom based on fear, but once she was gone, the community realized it didn't need a ruler, it needed a reset. With the HOA in total disarray, residents called an emergency town hall meeting to discuss the future of the board. Turnout was overwhelming. Folding chairs ran up. People stood along the walls, all buzzing with the same question: who's going to fix the mess Karen left behind? They didn't want another dictator. They wanted transparency, accountability, fairness. And somehow, as discussions swirled and names were tossed around, mine kept coming up. I had never aspired to be in charge of anything beyond my own front porch, but apparently, going toe-to-toe with Karen and surviving had turned me into some kind of local legend. They voted on it then and there. I didn't even get to prepare a speech. They handed me a clipboard and said, "Congratulations, you're the new HOA president." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. A part of me wanted to run from it, but another part, the one still seating over my demolished fence, decided this was the best opportunity to ensure no one like Karen ever got that kind of power again. So I accepted and made a promise, not just to the neighborhood, but to myself. We were going to rebuild. So I accepted and made a promise, not just to the neighborhood, but to myself. We were going to rebuild everything Karen tried to destroy, and we were going to do it together. The first order of business was transparency. We published all HOA records online, every dollar spent, every decision made, every meeting agenda. It was all out in the open. We created a suggestion box that wasn't just symbolic. Every note was read aloud during meetings, even the ones written in crayon. And surprisingly, people responded. They cared. When given a chance to speak, they spoke. And they didn't just complain, they offered solutions. Real ones. Someone even suggested a neighborhood tool library so folks could borrow equipment instead of buying their own. Another offered to lead weekend classes on basic home repair. The block transformed from a paranoid surveillance state into a genuine community, and the change was almost too fast to believe. But the one thing everyone wanted most was justice for the fence, not revenge justice. They didn't want just an apology. They wanted to make things right. So we got to work. I reached out to the Historical Society and secured a grant for restoration. Volunteers from the neighborhood helped clean the site, clear debris, and prepare the ground for reconstruction. A local blacksmith, inspired by the story, offered to help recreate the original design using techniques true to the time period. The pieces started coming together, one by one, like the neighborhood itself, damaged but not broken. Weeks later, we held a dedication ceremony. The new fence stood tall, proud, and more beautiful than ever. We installed a small spotlight to illuminate it at night, along with a plaque that told the story, how it was built, how it was destroyed, and how community came together to restore it. The crowd applauded, some even teared up. I gave a short speech, mostly off the cuff, thanking everyone for standing up when it mattered. Then someone shouted, "We should name it the Karen-proof fence," and laughter erupted. Of course, Karen herself didn't attend. She had become somewhat of a recluse since her legal troubles began stacking up. Her trial was still pending, but the court of public opinion had long since convicted her. Once perfect lawn was overgrown, the house that used to screen status now whispered neglect. A for sale sign sat crooked on her front yard for weeks without interest. People said she paced around inside, watching us through the curtains. She was no longer feared, just pitted. And if that wasn't poetic, I don't know what was. But her shadow hadn't entirely vanished. One day, a few weeks after the dedication, I found a typed letter in my mailbox, no return address. It was a rambling complaint about the new community garden, violating property values, filled with passive-aggressive phrasing and thinly veiled threats. I recognized the tone immediately. Karen was trying to stir trouble from behind the scenes. I chuckled and filed it in a folder labeled nonsense. But I also took it seriously because people like Karen don't change, they adopt. And I wasn't going to let her slither back in. We passed a new amendment to the HOA bylaws, remitting presidential powers, requiring board decisions to have a minimum quorum, and preventing any one person from holding office for more than 2 terms. It wasn't about locking Karen out. It was about locking tyranny out forever. And just like that, the organization she used to control became the very structure that would keep her away. With the HRA stabilized and the community thriving, we started celebrating small wins. A neighbor hosted the first block party in years. Someone brought a karaoke machine. Kids decorated their bikes and paraded down the street. We even got a bounce house and no one was spying for it. At some point, someone unveiled a cake shaped like the historical fence, complete with fondant flowers and little chocolate rivets. It was ridiculous and perfect. That night, as I sat on my porch watching flames laugh and kids chase fireflies, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not the kind that comes from silence or distance, but the kind that comes from belonging. Knowing that the people around you aren't just neighbors, they're allies. And that even when things fall apart, they can be rebuilt stronger than before. The battle with Karen had started over a fence, but it had revealed something deeper. It wasn't about metal or property lines. It was about power and what people do when they have too much of it. It was about courage and how hard it is to stand up when you feel alone. And it was about resilience, the quiet, stubborn kind that says no matter how much damage is done, we can always put things back together. Karen thought she could bulldoze history, but what she really did was awaken a neighborhood. And that was something no clipboard, no rulebook, and no power trip could ever undo. Just when the dust had finally settled and the neighborhood had begun to enjoy its newfound peace, the kind that comes only after chaos has been dragged into the light and dealt with, Karen did something no one expected. She came back, not in person with loud announcements or surprise visits, but through quiet, sneaking little acts that reminded everyone she wasn't quite done. It started with the mailboxes. One morning, I found mine stuffed full of anonymous violation slips, each listing absurd infractions like improper curb appeal and non-regulation outdoor lighting. They weren't official, had no HRA seal, signature, or date, but they were printed on the exact same paper the old notices used to come on. The font was the same. The tone unmistakably hers. It was like receiving ghost mail from a dictator who'd been dethroned that refused to stay buried. At first, I laughed it off, tossing the notices in a drawer, figuring it was just one last desperate attempt to feel relevant. But then other neighbors started getting them too. Rachel down the street received a citation for excessive wind chimes. Mr. Delaney got one for patio furniture misalignment. No one had reinstated those old rules. No one on the board had issued these letters. Karen was doing it all in secret, trying to spark confusion and fear like she used to, hoping, maybe, people would fall back in line. But the neighborhood wasn't the same anymore. We were smarter now, sharper. We didn't just laugh, we acted. One of the neighbors set up a camera near the community bulletin board. Another installed a motion detector on his porch. A few nights later, it paid off. A grainy video showed a figure in a long coat and oversized sunglasses slipping around houses at midnight, shoving envelopes into mailboxes. It wasn't even subtle. The footage was uploaded to the neighborhood forum with the title, Karen's Comeback Tour. The video spread like wildfire, and with it, so did the last of her credibility. Still, Karen wasn't done. After her mailbox campaign failed, she tried something even bolder. She filed a lawsuit against me, claiming I had caused her emotional distress, slandered her reputation, and orchestrated a neighborhood conspiracy to ruin her life. Her lawyer was some third-rate hack who looked like he was on retainer from a late-night infomercial. The filing itself was laughable, riddled with spelling errors and flimsy claims, but it still meant I had to go to court. I wasn't angry. I was stunned. After everything she had done, the fines, the fence, the federal investigation, she actually thought she could paint herself as the victim. In the courtroom, Karen showed up wearing a beige suit and a frozen smile. She tried to look composed, but the twitch in her left eye gave her away. Her lawyer bumbled through the opening statements, claiming I had waged a campaign of psychological warfare and that Karen now lived in fear, unable to garden in peace or enjoy the simple joys of HOA leadership. The judge listened politely, then turned to my lawyer, who calmly slid a thick binder onto the table. He called it Exhibit A, the saga of Karen. Inside were screenshots of her fake notices, sworn testimonies from neighbors, financial records of her misuse of HOA funds, photos of the destroyed fence, and most damning of all, the video of her sneaking through the neighborhood like a wannabe spy. The judge flipped through the binder slowly, page after page, until he finally looked up. His face said it all. He didn't even need to hear the rest. The judge dismissed her case with a sigh. Karen's empire? Reduced to a footnote in the story she tried to erase. As she stormed out, her heels echoing louder than her words, no one followed. No one comforted her. The woman who once ruled the neighborhood with citations and condescension now walked alone. Back in the neighborhood, her house went up for sale again. This time, someone added a sticky note on the sign that read, "Includes free popcorn-worthy backstory." It stayed there for a week before rain washed it away. People stopped avoiding her street. Kids played near her yard again. The silence around her property was no longer fear, it was freedom. To celebrate the final nail in Karen's coffin, the neighborhood hosted a proper block party, this time bigger than ever. There were bounce houses, food trucks, games for the kids, and a massive banner that read, "Welcome back, Vanity." At one point, someone unveiled another cake shaped like the original iron fence, complete with edible rust and sugar flowers. I was asked to give a speech, something short to mark the occasion. I stepped onto the makeshift stage and looked out at the people who, not long ago, were strangers quietly enduring the tyranny of a clipboard-wielding bully. I told them the truth. That fence was never just a fence. It was history. And when Karen destroyed it, she tried to erase more than metal. She tried to erase identity, legacy, voice. But what she didn't expect was that her bulldozer would awaken something stronger. But in trying to silence one house, she ended up waking the whole neighborhood. People cheered, some clapped just a little too hard, and then the DJ kicked in with a playlist of songs everyone could agree on, none of which were HOA approved. The most surreal moment came weeks later when I saw a tour group stop in front of the new fence. They stood quietly as the guide explained its story, how it had stood for over a century before being destroyed by an overzealous HOA president, then rebuilt by the very people she tried to control. The guide pointed to a small plaque we installed beneath the gate. It read, "This fence stood against time and against tyranny, rebuilt not by one but by many. May it remind us that power lies with those who stand, not those who rule." One tourist asked, "Did someone really get arrested over this?" The guide smiled. "Not arrested. Not yet. But the story isn't over, it never is." Karen's story had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when power is unchecked. But ours had become something more, a story of resilience, community, and yes, a little bit of well-earned revenge. We weren't just a neighborhood anymore. We were something stronger, bound not by rules but by experience. And every time someone new passed by that gate, the fence told them a story that no one could bulldoze again. The new fence gleamed, its pock a warning. History remembers those who fight. Karen's legacy, a for sale sign, and a neighborhood that learned to roar.